As regular viewers will know, I love Lima diesels, especially the Class 47s. They look right, perform extremely well, and most importantly for me, can be picked up on auction sites for very reasonable prices. These cost me £84 for the two, which I think is a bargain. Less than the price for one Hornby Railroad Class 47, which to my eyes at least doesn't look half as realistic. The only problem I have, apart from the horrible large D-loop couplings, is that these two look so good it almost seems a pity to try to modify and improve them. But improve them I must, so let's start. I started work on both locos together, hoping this might save time, but later decided to concentrate on one at a time, as my workbench was getting a bit full. The first task was to add extra pickups to the trailing bogies to improve reliability and prevent stalling or hesitancy over my dead frog points. The huge Lima weight was glued to the chassis, on top of which was glued a piece of white plasticard, and on top of that 2 phosphor bronze strips. Wires were soldered from one end of the phosphor bronze strips to the motor, and from the other ends through the chassis to be connected to the trailing bogie. This underside view of the trailing bogie shows another phosphor bronze strip glued on and 2 pickup wires soldered to it. The ends of the wires bear lightly on the backs of the bogie wheels. A further wire, which can't be seen in this view, takes current back through the chassis to one of the phosphor bronze strips on top of the large Lima chassis weight. Another improvement I wanted to make was the addition of a working high-intensity lamp on the front of each loco. I used LEDs obtained from DCC Concepts, but I didn't want them to be too bright, so 2 3K resistors were soldered in series onto each LED. The rears of the LEDs were given a coat of matte black paint to stop any light straying into the cabs. Shrink tubing covered my horrible soldering, which means that the wiring looks rather a mess, but when power was applied, the LEDs worked. I wanted the front view of the locos to be as prototypical as possible, so I purchased some packs of vacuum pipes, dummy screw couplings and jumper cables from West Hill Wagon Works. These are excellent and very detailed, but a word of caution. They are 3D printed and therefore quite fragile. If like me you are clumsy, and if like me you take your models to run on club tracks, they might not be for you. Having said that, the parts come with excellent sets of instructions, and once painted carefully really look the part, almost museum quality I would say. The completed and painted parts are shown here in a jam jar lid before fitting. I discovered on the internet this line drawing of the front of a Class 47 showing the positions of the various pipes, which I roughly coloured in to match the pipes I had already finished. This was a great help in knowing where to drill holes in the buffer beams. In real life, the Fragonset 47 I was modifying had previously spent time as a push-pull loco working from Glasgow to Edinburgh. It was therefore fitted with extra jumper cables on the cab fronts and some extra cooling pipes on one side. Both of these were purchased from West Hill Wagon Works. The body of 47565 responsive broken down into its component parts: cab interior, glazing strip, cab windows, and buffers, and a similar shot of the parts for the Fragonset Loco 47710. A close-up shot of the ends of both locos showing the Lima painted markings where the jumper cables should go. The driver figures were purchased from Model U and are very fine 3D printed mouldings, which are seen here partly painted. The two chassis have had the bogies and one D-shaped coupling weathered with my usual dirty brown mix. The motor bogie has had the D-shaped coupling left on, as I need that end to couple to my rolling stock. The couplings on the trailing bogies have not been weathered, as they will be cut off later. The bodies were masked up and the roofs airbrushed with Humbrol No. 32 dark grey enamel. The masking tape was removed from the body of 47710 and the lower parts given a light airbrushing of grime. The two drivers have now had their final coats of paint and have been glued into place on their respective driving seats in the cabs. The extra wiring I had added on top of the Lima chassis weights meant that the main glazing strips would no longer fit, so the offending middle portion was simply cut out. This underside shot of the body of 47710 shows the shortened main glazing strips, the end cab glazing windows and the cab interior all fitting back nicely. Close-up views of the cab showing the driver in position. At this stage I decided not to continue with modifying both locos together, but to concentrate firstly on 47710. This close-up view shows the driver in position, the cab end having been weathered or dirtied, and some rather inept holes drilled in the buffer beam. These will be disguised later, but I've included this shot to show what a bodger I am. This three-quarter view shows clearly that the horrible Lima D coupling has now been cut off. It was moulded onto the bogie, so if you're going to remove it, remember, there's no going back, and if at any future time you wish to couple rolling stock to this end of the loco, you're probably going to have to invest in a new bogie. As mentioned earlier, 47710 has had extra cooling pipes added to one side of the chassis, and these were also purchased from West Hill Wagon Works. Front view of 47710 with all the West Hill Wagon Works detail parts added and the Lima buffers replaced. The jumper cables have simply been glued in place over the existing Lima markings and almost fit. I reckon it looks good. The rear of the Fragonset Loco has had the Lima coupling left in place, and in order to allow it to work properly and swing on curves, extra vacuum pipes etc. are not an option here. There is room, however, for a shortened screw coupling and also for jumper cables. Returning to 47565 responsive, it has also now had a light airbrushing of grime, paying particular attention to the lower areas of the body. The Lima interior glazing strip for 47565 has been shortened in the same way as that for the Fragonset Loco. I mentioned earlier that I found the West Hill Wagon Works pipes and couplings rather fragile, and unfortunately I've already managed to break some. So for 47565 I decided to make my own pipes from round brass rod. These were glued into holes in the buffer beam but protruded somewhat on the inside. The loco body is a very tight fit here, and in order to allow it to be removed and replaced, I thought it might be necessary to cut away a chunk of the chassis. Careful cutting out was the order of the day in order not to damage its structural integrity. The underside shot shows my crude brass pipes protruding through the buffer beam. At this stage it suddenly occurred to me that it might have been better and easier just to snip them off flush rather than carve a lump out of the chassis. If only I'd thought of this before. They say you learn from your mistakes. The completed body of the Res 47 responsive was placed back on its bogies, and yes, it did clear the chassis nicely. The last thing to do was to replace the buffers which hold the body in place on the chassis. This front view shows the screw coupling from West Hill Works and my attempts at the pipes fashioned from brass rod. I don't think they look too bad. They are stronger and not as delicate or as detailed as the 3D printed ones, but okay at normal viewing distances. I should add at this point that I run all my models on my local club layout, and it's the transporting them there which causes all the damage to the delicate parts. I did say I'm clumsy. A couple of views of the completed locos on the unfinished part of my layout, in similar positions to those at the start of the video, for comparison purposes. And now, some running shots showing that the high intensity lights do actually work. Firstly, 47710 on its own, and then some shots of both locos running together. In my humble opinion, working lights on most 00 scale locos are just too bright, so I wanted mine to be just that little bit dimmer. Maybe to look as though they were a bit dirty, just like the rest of the locos. The light in the Res 47 looks a little brighter when running next to the Fragonset loco. This is because I installed the LED a little further forward in the cab by cutting away the lower portion of the cab windows and gluing it directly into the cab front. This does not notice, however, when the locos are run on their own. Well, I don't know about you, but I think these diesels look a lot better for the modifications I've made to them, and may even hold their own in company with much more expensive modern offerings. Or am I a little bit biased? Anyway, that's all for now. See you next time.